Promise, give us your product or service, we'll turn it into a platform in 30 seconds or less, or your money back.
Welcome to our platform series with Andre and Julian. Today, 7 out of the 10 top most valuable public companies are built around platform businesses. And Craigslist, which is a platform business in 2019, generated $1 billion in revenues with only 50 employees and around 90% profit margins. While despite its design and features has hardly changed in the last 15 years. So in this video, we will illuminate what you need to know about platform businesses. Let's start with the first question. What are platform businesses?
At the simplest level, platform businesses are businesses that connect customers. Okay, they connect their customers together. And so, that can be enabling them to do transactions, to interact, to communicate, and a whole host of things. Okay, but it's very different from a traditional business that produces a product and sells it to consumers. Here, they're not producing a product that they sell. Their product is actually the fact that they're connecting these customers together.
So, and these interactions can take many different forms. So, like Julian mentioned, it could be commercial transactions. So, I think the best known examples of successful platform businesses that come to mind would be something like Airbnb, eBay, Amazon.com, the marketplace, TaskRabbit. And there's a ton of these, which basically there's a supply side and there's a demand side, and the platform allows the two sides to conduct commercial transactions. Then there are other platforms which just enable pure communication, or networking. So social networks would fit that bill. Something like Facebook or Snapchat or Twitter. There's lots of users, and it doesn't really enable commercial transactions, but rather people exchanging information or communicating. Zoom would also work here. Zoom would also qualify as a platform business in that it enables people to communicate with one another. And of course, there are many others. There's dating apps like Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, whatever the relevant dating app is in your region.
And of course, the recent rise of all the delivery, platform companies of Uber and delivering every single thing that you want, from drugs to alcohol and pharmacy.
Yeah, I think we would. Yeah, absolutely. So think of something, I don't know, like Deliveroo or DoorDash, which connect restaurants with consumers. And also in some cases, depending on the business model of specific delivery platforms, they also have a third side, which is independent couriers or whatever they're called, the people who actually do the delivery.
What about digital goods platform? For example, like Apple App Store, is that also a platform business?
Yeah, absolutely. So they connect consumers. So let's say in the case of Apple, it would be consumers that have iPhones with developers that create apps for the iPhone.
And payments and...
Another example where you're connecting the retailers or merchants that accept payment with the customers who want to buy something, right? So and there it's very much a transactional kind of relationship, like what I'm providing as a platform is the ability to do this transaction in a more convenient way between my two types of customers. If I'm Amex or PayPal, my two customers are the merchants and the consumers, right? And I'm connecting those two. Visa and MasterCard are a little bit more complicated because they don't have direct relationships with the final customers. They go through banks, right? So it's a more complicated platform that involves many parties, right? And you have issuing banks on the cardholder side, and you have acquiring banks on the merchant side, and they bring them all together. But yeah, basically, if you think about that whole system, it's a platform.
What about on the B2B side? Do you have some example of B2B platforms?
Sure. So let's think about things like Salesforce, for example, which created an AppExchange. So it connects their business customers that use Salesforce products and third-party developers of other business relevant software. And there's many B2B marketplaces. So many companies that create that enable commercial transactions between business customers.
Well, I mean, Amazon Web Services, obviously AWS, they have a big marketplace with all the software providers, selling their software to their the businesses that use AWS. And if you look at almost every large software as a service player, whether it's for Twilio or any of these ones, Shopify, as B2B players, they all tend to have these big marketplaces where developers come in and provide their software to the businesses. Okay,
Right.
so if you're on Shopify as a merchant using Shopify to power your website, you want to have a whole lot of other add-ons and additional services that you can use for your business. They're all available on Shopify through their marketplace.
I think it's worth noting here, as we talk about through all of these examples of platform businesses, it's very important to recall some of these businesses were born as platform businesses from day one. So they were marketplaces. So say something like eBay. eBay was a marketplace from day one. Others were actually born as products, so one-sided typical products, and then later became platforms. So what Julian mentioned, for example, a lot of B2B software products, even so say Shopify or Amazon Web Services, initially, they were just that, they were just products. Later on, when they became very successful, lots of businesses were using them, they essentially opened up to allow third-party providers of other complementary services to sell to their customers. So I think we can go into more depth on this specific type of transformation into a later video, but I think it's worthwhile emphasizing here that a lot of platform businesses were not necessarily born as platforms from day one.
And just to add on to that, I mean, this is a good place to make the distinction between the sort of linear business model and the platform business model. Because if you think about what Shopify originally did, they were producing a product. They had a way of enabling businesses to, have a nice website. So their product was designing, a package where businesses could have a nice website very easily. And that was something that Shopify produced and sold to businesses. Okay, that's a linear business model. They produce something and they sell it to their customers. Then, later on, they realized there were lots of other products that these businesses wanted to use for their websites, right? Add-ons and widgets and so on, which Shopify couldn't produce all of them. Just so many different options and possibilities. And it made sense for them to open that up to other developers to provide their products and services to sell to these businesses. And that's where you become a platform, because you're now connecting your different customers. Right? You're connecting your customers, which are developers, and your customers, which are the businesses, the merchants.
So in this diagram, actually, it shows the difference between linear business and multi-sided platform, physical and digital companies. And increasingly, a lot of companies are actually going through digital transformation, especially, accelerated with COVID as the top priority, right? So the arrow shows some of the different pathways and possibilities. And obviously, one clear pathway is really moving from a product to a linear business to a platform business, which is what we're saying. And that we will want to cover this more in detail in our next few videos.
The businesses, and that's evident in that diagram, they don't have to be online, right? Platforms don't have to be online. There's plenty of physical platforms like a shopping mall, which brings together the retailers or the shops and the consumer who wants to buy at those shops. And of course, I guess many platforms like classifieds in the past were physical, before they moved online. And so the distinction between online and physical is not what defines a platform. It's more this distinction between the linear business model and this platform business model connecting customers.
To know that actually a farmer's market or a traditional business of a shopping mall is also actually a platform business, because, that dot didn't really connect for me. One-sided and multi-sided platform?
Yeah, I mean, just to recap, on one side, that it would be things like, say, Zoom, where basically everyone is pretty much the same. Everyone's a user of Zoom, and Zoom enables people to communicate. Two-sided would be something where there's a clear distinction between the two sides. So, say Airbnb, there are hosts, and then there's travelers, or eBay, where there's buyer, or Alibaba, there's buyers and there's sellers. And then, of course, you have three-sided, four-sided, five-sided. So something like Facebook. I mean, I think I lost count, but there's at least four sides. It's users, advertisers, app developers, other websites that connect now with users, allow users to connect to them using their Facebook credentials and so on.
It's clearly, shown that a SaaS is not a platform business. So let's talk about what is not a platform business, but often mistaken as one.
Right. So I think this is where our definition of platform businesses can seem deceptively simple. So again, and just in a few words, platforms are about enabling transactions. Now, the devil is in the details. So let's use some examples. A lot of people would call Netflix a platform for whatever reason. According to our definition, Netflix is not a platform. And the reason is very simple. Users go to Netflix and Netflix has full control of the inventory of movies or TV series that is shown or sold to consumers under a subscription. At no point does a Netflix user have a direct interaction, like transacts directly with the movie studio who licenses their shows or their movies to Netflix. So contrast Netflix to something like YouTube, where basically YouTube is not in the business of actually licensing the shows. They're just enabling millions of video content creators, large and small, to provide their content to users. Now, of course, YouTube does exert some control. They provide some guidelines, but there's a very clear difference between YouTube and Netflix, where Netflix actually, even though this is a digital product, they do take inventory, quote unquote, risk in the sense they either have to produce or actually acquire the licenses to the movies or the shows that they will show to users. And they sell everything under a subscription. That is not the case for YouTube. So YouTube is a platform business, Netflix is not.
So I'm going to bring back to the point on Netflix and YouTube, because one of the key things with Netflix is that what you're seeing is the flooding of competitors that compete with Netflix really quickly. You have, the producer themselves are having their own streaming service like Disney, and obviously here we have Stan as well. So it seems that it become a crowded marketplace, also as well as Uber, right, with Lyft. But instead with YouTube, you're not seeing a YouTube equivalent.
That's a good example. I mean, part of the reason we like platform businesses is that they're much more scalable than their non-platform counterparts. So Netflix is a great business. However, it's scalable. It has great scale, but it's nothing like YouTube, because in order to scale, Netflix actually either has to invest in creating its own content. That's very risky and it's very expensive, or they have to go and acquire high quality content, which is also pretty expensive, versus something like YouTube, where they can just tell, third-party content creators, hey, please offer the content on our website. That doesn't really involve much in terms of additional cost for YouTube.
Yeah, I think it's worth emphasizing here, Andrei's made pretty clear distinction, but of course, in reality, there's a continuum between what a platform business is, clear-cut platform businesses, where the firm, the business, is purely in the business of just enabling these direct interactions between the different customers and doesn't get involved at all in controlling those interactions. And when we think about pure platform businesses, eBay would be sort of a prototypical example. Okay.
I would put maybe Craigslist
even higher, yeah. So they really don't get involved at all.
Yeah, zero involvement.
Exactly. And at the other extreme, you have, like a very typical retailer that buys the product, maybe at 7-Eleven or something like that. They buy the products, they have them in their shops, and they control the interaction with the customer completely. They set the prices, they determine the marketing of the products, and so on. Okay. And in between those two extremes, there are, of course, a continuum of different business models. So some are more like platforms, some are more like linear business models, some are sort of in the middle. If you think about something like Uber or Lyft, they are a little bit more in the middle than at the extreme, because Uber, if you think about it, yes, it sort of connects the drivers with the riders, but it actually determines the price, right? And it puts a lot of, it determines that you can only reject, as a driver, you can only reject a certain percentage of rides, otherwise you get kicked off. So it puts a lot of sort of constraints, and it controls a lot of that interaction. Now, but it does give some freedom, right? It does allow the drivers to drive whatever car they want, subject to some, minimum standards. And it does let them drive whatever hours they want, right? They don't have to turn up, for a fixed shift like they might have to under traditional employment model. So, that's Uber. You can think on that continuum. It's towards a platform, but it's not a perfect example of a platform. And that's because it's exercising some of the control. It's getting itself in the middle of those interactions. It's no longer just in the business of allowing people to interact, enabling that. It's actually controlling some of that interaction itself. And we can, go through other examples where businesses are somewhere in that middle ground.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think this point about the continuum is fundamental. And I think both Julian and I have this point of view that we don't find it very helpful to be in the business of labeling different business models. This is a platform, this is not a platform. Because again, given that there's that continuum, you can say you're either closer or further from a pure platform business. Now, that's still very informative. And in fact, it's also very useful when you think about strategy or how the positioning of a given company may change over time. So you may start as a pure platform and then move towards more of a control, let's call it control platform, and then finally move all the way to a retailer, or you can go the other way around. So a good example here, for instance, is Zappos. So Zappos online, probably one of the best customer experience retailers online, mostly sells shoes. Zappos, for their first year of operation, when they initially started, they just wanted to be the eBay of shoes. So initially they were a pure platform, a pure marketplace. After a year, they just realized we want to control the customer experience. If that's what we want to do, we can't be a marketplace. We actually have to take inventory. They built warehouses and they moved completely from the retail end of the spectrum, from the pure marketplace end of the spectrum, all the way to the other side. So today, Zappos is mostly a retailer. It's not a marketplace or a platform business.
A lot of online retailers that aggregate merchants could be mistaken as a platform businesses. So if they aggregate and own the inventory, they are a retailer. If they actually do not own inventory but facilitate the transaction and sale of those merchants' product, then it's more like a platform business. Is that correct?
That's correct. So that's back to the distinction that we made between Netflix and YouTube. And you're right, like also retailers online and offline versus marketplaces.
And of course, there are examples going in the other direction. So, most famous of which is probably Amazon, which started as obviously a book retailer, online book retailer, and over time opened up a marketplace for third-party sellers of all kinds of other products. And to become the everything store, it wanted to provide everything. It couldn't provide everything itself, so it made sense to become a marketplace and therefore a platform.
They are actually really looking at controlling the fulfillment, the last mile part of it, in terms of having the inventory, in the warehouse, and then controlling the fulfillment of it.
For certain products, like they don't do that for every product, but certainly for the for the core products that they're focused on, yes, they want to do that. Even at the same time as there may be third-party sellers that are also selling directly to customers, who have control, but they want to offer Amazon wants to offer to their customers the ability to buy, certain products directly from Amazon with the Amazon customer experience, right? But there are other niche products that they're not in the business of supplying, and those are only provided by third-party sellers, and they don't always even offer the logistics for those.
And I think this emphasizes, the fulfilled by Amazon example, this emphasizes how fine-grained this continuum can be. So if you think of Amazon, it occupies almost the entire spectrum, from products that are entirely built and sold by Amazon, like a normal retailer or a product company. So that's like on the retail end side of the spectrum. Then you move a little bit towards marketplace, but not so. Now you get stuff like fulfilled by Amazon. So it's sold by third parties, but Amazon controls the logistics. And then you move all the way to marketplace, which is what Julian said, long tail products that Amazon never actually even wants to touch. So they're sold direct, like no different than eBay, like third parties selling directly to consumers without Amazon ever touching them.
It's under the same point of a B2B example of what is not a platform but mistaken as one.
There's another type of confusion which arises, and typically in B2B contexts. So firms that just provide B2B products or services are oftentimes called platform businesses for, honestly, I'm not sure, for no good reason. So, good example here would be, say, Amazon Web Services up until, I think, 2012. So Amazon Web Services initially, for its first few years of operations, was not a platform business. It was just a product. Yes, it was a B2B product in the sense it provided cloud infrastructure and cloud computation services for businesses. but it's not a platform business. Those are just products. Now, starting in, I think it was 2012, they opened up to third parties and became a platform business, as Julian described earlier, by allowing third-party providers of complementary software and hardware to serve the same customers that were being served by AWS. So that's an example I think everyone can relate to, AWS. But there, I mean, we see, Julian and I see many startups that provide B2B services or B2B products that call themselves platforms, when in fact they're just glorified B2B products.
Yeah, I think that got to do with the whole technology terminology in terms of a technology platform. Is usually a technology stack thing that they call themselves a platform, but then a platform that has a product business model.
Exactly.
I think that's
exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah, and we come across this a lot. So people in the tech who come from a tech background, they will tend to call anything which has some common sort of underlying software or operating system, that runs everything. They'll call that a platform. So AWS is a common infrastructure that everyone uses to do the computing. They call that a platform. And it is a platform in some meaning of the word, right? Like it's a common base on which you build other stuff. Okay, so that's, and so if you're in a tech mindset, then that's how it's used, but it's not a platform business model, right? It's not a platform business. At least we should make that distinction, right? Like it could be called a platform in some physical sense, but not as a business.
What about the iOS and OS? Do you call it a tech platform or you take a tech platform business?
I think operating systems are platform businesses insofar as they have at least two types of customers. So end users, and third-party app developers. I mean, an operating system by itself is not very valuable, right? I mean, all of them need third-party developers. And they're definitely enable interactions between those two parties. So in the case of Apple, so Apple iOS, we would call it two-sided because, well, Apple provides the hardware too, right? So it's hardware plus software integrated together. And then you have users and app developers. Something like Android is three-sided because you have users, app developers, and you also have third-party hardware makers. So there are many different companies that provide Android-powered phones.
This is somewhere where I think the tech people and the business people would agree, right? Everyone says these are platforms because they're both tech platforms in the traditional meaning of the word, right? In terms of software platforms, and they're business platforms, right? The business model is a platform business model. They're connecting customers, and that's what they're in the business of doing. So, this is a common agreement. Where things diverge is, when you get to businesses that either one of the other quadrants. So they're physical software type platforms, but they don't have a platform business model, right? Or they're platform business models, but they don't have any sort of underlying common software infrastructure.
I mean, this is not trying to split hairs to say like we want to call this is a platform, this is not a platform. Again, that's not what's interesting about it. It actually does have important practical implications. Platform businesses have certain characteristics that make them much more scalable and much more attractive than non-platform businesses. So it's worthwhile to be relatively disciplined, at least in our view, when applying the term platform business, because it does mean that there's some characteristics that come with it. There are many B2B startups, right? I mean, startups that provide different elements of business infrastructure. So there's many. So for example, the business infrastructure for all kinds of traditionally offline businesses, such as restaurants and others, they're trying to digitize. So there's lots of companies that provide services, B2B services to these companies. Now, some of them are actually platform businesses, but I would say the vast majority are just B2B products. So they should not be called, they're certainly not platform businesses according to our definition.
Do you have an example?
Right, so a good example would be, actually Julian will appreciate this because it's named after his favorite bird from New Zealand, which I think it's Kia. So there's a company called Kia which provides, Julian reminded me, was it like online order? So a software system that allows restaurants to accept online or voice activated orders or something like that.
Yeah. So when you make an order on the phone, they will take that order using AI. They will process it and input the order into their system, so you can get whatever you want. And if there's any ambiguity, it'll reroute it to a person who will pick up the call, right? So for the vast majority of calls, it's able, using AI, to actually handle the call automatically without you actually talking to another person. And that obviously saves a lot of labor time. This is typically for fast food type restaurants and chains in the US.
Right. So again, I think that's a tech platform, and it provides a very important B2B product that makes things more efficient, and you can think about it as becoming part of the fast food chain tech stack. But it is not a platform business. It's just a pure product or service.
It's a bit because the way they sell is that they just sell to the restaurant basically to have this as a communication platform to their customer to increase the efficiency of ordering, right? They are not actually trying to acquire consumer and sell the consumer to use this, like Uber, because that's what Uber is saying. Use Uber to actually get a cab, as an intermediary. Right. They are not trying to position themselves as an intermediary.
No, not at the moment. Yes, that's exactly right. It's just purely they're selling the system to restaurants. They're not helping in any way restaurants acquire customers. It's purely saying, here's a software service.
Yeah, and one thing we've found with these, because we looked at these for many years, and we've seen them grow, and a lot of these, when they become big, so their B2B product becomes big, popular, lots of people using it. That's when they start opening up this marketplace for third-party developers to provide add-on services, the tools and the widgets, like Shopify did, like Amazon Web Services did. And so we can see a lot of these, even Care could do that in the future, which is open themselves up by creating a marketplace. And in that sense, they do become a platform business, but only on that side of it, right? Between the developer and their customers, which are the merchants. Another way they could become a platform, as you say, is to try and get the end user, the end customers directly onto their, become an intermediary between those end users and the businesses they're serving. So there's different ways they could become a platform, and obviously that's something we can go into much more detail on when we talk about it, going from product to platform.
If you have any question to ask, whether if this business is actually a platform business or not, feel free to actually also comment on the video, and it's a good question. We will answer it in our next video as well. Given the fact that these platform businesses have hyper growth, and when they dominate the market, it seems that it's really difficult to unseat them. Why is it important to distinguish them, and what are some of the common key characteristics about them?
Fundamentally, there are two main things that make platform businesses special or very attractive. Number one, it's network effects. So inherent in the definition that we gave of platform businesses, that they're connecting customers, they're enabling connections or transactions between customers, is the fact that there's a network effect. In other words, the more participants come onto the platform, the more valuable it is, because there are more parties to interact with. So the more buyers come to eBay, the more valuable it is for sellers to be on eBay, and vice versa. Same for Airbnb, same for Facebook, same for all the platform examples that we've seen. So network effects is the main characteristic of platform businesses. The other important characteristics, which is also inherent to definition, because platforms are they're not in the business of providing products or services, but rather in the business of enabling transactions, their cost structures tend to be very low. Again, think about something like Airbnb, which just allows tourists or travelers to find and book stays with third-party hosts. So compare Airbnb's cost structure with the cost structure of a hotel chain like Hilton. Well, Hilton owns all the hotels, right? So yeah, sure, they have a lot of hotels and there's lots of variety, but at a much higher cost, right? Airbnb is infinitely more scalable because they don't have to own any of the inventory. And we can run all the same comparison for all platform businesses. So I would say the combination of network effects with very low cost structures is what really makes platform businesses very desirable, both for entrepreneurs who want to build them, and also for investors like us who would like to figure out what the next Airbnb or the next eBay is so we can invest in.
In a platform business, you are in the business of creating and managing network effects, because if you're connecting customers, the more customers you get, the more possible connections those customers can have, the more value they get from those potential interactions, right? So in all these businesses, you tend to see network effects, and network effects provide defensibility for these businesses. So one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of copycat YouTube competitors is because people will go to YouTube to discover all this content, right, that's been produced, and for another competitor to compete with that, they have to somehow get a huge amount of supply, and they're not going to be able to get a huge amount of supply content created unless they have a lot of demand. But people are not going to come there if there's no content, so they're kind of stuck, right, with this chicken and egg problem, which YouTube has solved and has lots of supply and lots of demand. So the network effects provide defensibility and can explain why something like YouTube is going to be around for a long time. We would think. Just add on one thing that can be important as well, given the nature of the platform business model, which is enabling these customers to interact and so on, is you do tend to get quite a lot of value that's created at the edges, right, from the customers themselves. So if you think about Facebook, it enabled people to connect together and share stuff, but then you get all this creativity like from those creators, from those customers. That is what the network effect is. The more people on there, the more value is created. But sometimes that network effect is sort of super powerful because the customers themselves create a whole lot of content that creates value for the other side. So YouTube is a good example where there's a lot of value created. It's not just like that I hooked up people and people creating videos, but actually all the value created from those producers on YouTube who created all this interesting content, right? And you see that in a lot of these platforms, like not so much in sort of the business type platforms or like in something like eBay, but more in the sort of content or creative platforms like YouTube, where you can get a lot of, in Twitter, of course, you get a lot of creative stuff happening that's it's all created from the customers. So yeah, it really leverages that ability to create value from your users rather than yourself. So that sort of user-generated content, I would say, is sort of a third aspect that plays a role in platforms.
The implication of that is like platform businesses are much more like scale a lot faster. And in some sense, like they reach escape velocity a lot faster than most other businesses. Like I think it's a non-controversial statement to say that platform businesses are probably the best business model to build or to invest in for these reasons.
For example, with Netflix, they really curate the kind of content that needs to be on the platform. And then they actually either now own the last mile, which is going vertical in the original, creating original content, or actually have to get the rights for those content and to own them. So they have to curate and decide what the user want to see. I think with the whole user-generated content is that it allows the agility where, whatever user is seeing on the grassroots level that they think is going to be of interest to other people, there's a much more, sense of allowing that creativity or hitting the right, trend, when it's happening. And that allows the really immediate engagement on both sides without the centralized control of deciding what people want to watch. That makes it, really interesting.
Well, not to put too fine a point on that, but I think it's important to realize that even in that case, right? So even like something like YouTube, I mean, YouTube does, so it is true that they allow a lot of creativity, a million flowers bloom and so on and so forth. But, like most platforms do have some curation or some controls, right? I mean, it makes sense. You don't want to allow quite everything. I mean, certainly there's, there's some things that you don't want.
Yeah, you're talking about governance in a sense and making sure that the trust and the quality control is there. But in terms of, what could come out and born out of the platform itself in terms of content creativity is an interesting one. Because in Australia, there's a company called redbubble.com. It has been around for quite some time, but it's one of the global company that's really interesting because it allows artist-generated content to be produced into product as on demand, right? So that's actually really interesting.
Yeah, it's allowing that interaction again between the producers, allowing them the freedom to put up their, within certain bounds what they want, and then the sort of feedback from the customer side, right? And that interaction between the feedback and the producers can create all kinds of things that the intermediary would have no hope of creating or dreaming up, right? And even if you think about business platforms like Amazon, right? Whereas, you don't have quite so much creativity, but there's still a lot of products there that Amazon wouldn't have dreamt of, oh, should I stock this product or should I produce this product? You have to leave it to the imagination of these third parties, what they can produce, what they can sell, and what consumers will want, what the feedback will be. So I think that sort of openness, let's say, of the platform is another important dimension if we compare it to a linear business model where the intermediary is deciding and controlling everything. Here you're sort of open to a certain extent.
I have a great example of this. I think my favorite example of creativity that can only happen on platforms. Have you guys heard of an app, the greatest app on the iPhone? It's called I Am Rich. You can look it up. So it was first created. So it was a funny story. So it was first created in the first few months when the App Store was open in 2008. So it's an app that places a red ruby on your phone screen, and that's it. It's 5 lines of code. And that app was sold for like $999, like maximum price allowed on the App Store. And of course, I mean, again, this is like great creativity. I thought it was amazing. But of course, Apple, because they're control freaks, took it out. So after a few months, they decided for whatever reason, they took it out. So interestingly, today, of course, you can find many different versions of I Am Rich on Android, which is partly why Julian and I own Android phones. And you cannot find such a creative app, an amazing app on the iPhone.
So other than network effects and good margins, and possibly some of them are a winner take all type of companies, is there anything else that are key characteristic about either a platform businesses or building one?
But in terms of building one, the chicken and egg problem is an obvious characteristic of building a platform business, right? Because if you want to, if given the network effect, if you want to create value, you have to have users on the other side that people want to interact with. But how do you get sellers if you don't have any buyers, and how do you get buyers if you don't have any sellers? So this is a perennial problem for building any platform business.
Yes, we painted, and we strongly believe that platforms, when successful, are the most attractive businesses to build or invest in. But there is a trade-off. They're also the hardest ones, right? So the success rate of platforms is probably much lower than traditional product businesses. And a big part of the reason is exactly what Julian just described. Most platforms cannot even, they can't get past the chicken and egg problem. So what makes network effects very valuable once the wheel starts turning is also what makes them very difficult to start. Like the engine, like it's very, very difficult initially, because you need actually people on one side or whatever the relevant sides are to be present.
Wouldn't that sort of have an impact really on the possibility of them really generating revenue, early days? It's almost as if they really need a lot of money and funding to actually get it going, number one. They need critical mass before they could make money in some ways. And a lot of time they need so much volume in order to actually make any kind of business that is sustainable on their own. So that is probably one of the key challenges that I see as well.
So that's definitely right. It is very challenging. They need resources up front, but there are a lot of hacks to get going. And probably the most important of which is don't spread yourself too thin, right? Like focus on a very narrow scope, maybe geographic scope. If you're like Uber starting off, right? Start in one location, and and try and build that flywheel at a very local level, a very small level, and thereby you limit the amount of resources that you require to start, and from that you can then expand out, right? So I mean, there are many different ways to solve the chicken and egg problem, but it can be solved, and obviously it can be, because we see so many successful platform businesses. But it is, it's not easy. It does require resources. It does require convincing investors up front that this can work. But it can be solved. There are other issues, like an important issue with two-sided or multi-sided platform businesses is they have to decide on their price structure, how much they charge, to each of their different customer groups, which is somewhat a unique challenge to these businesses, in the sense that can actually play a very critical role. Like for some businesses, if they start charging both buyer and seller, they just cannot get going because they can't get the buyers or the sellers. In other businesses, other cases, you just want to charge one side, give it away for free on the other, and you get all the, makes it easier to get going. So it's more related to solving the chicken and egg problem.
Is there anything in terms of how they compete differently as well? Do you have any point to add to that?
one general observation is that firms will compete more aggressively up front. Like, it's because the gains from winning are so much higher, you tend to see very intense competition in early days, willing to, burn through a lot of investor dollars to give away products to build up critical mass to become the dominant network. And then later on, once they've established themselves, you tend to see prices increase and softening of competition. So that's sort of a general dynamic you might see in these types of businesses with network effects.
Yeah, I think so. The compete differently. I think one of the key things is also because it's more or less a winner take all thing. There's no such thing as creating into you're niching into a position of one market kind of thing. It's almost as if it's like you have to compete and take all. And go towards and drive towards that and grow very fast to own the market.
Yeah, I would say that the companies certainly act like that. It's not always true that it's a winner takes all. They certainly investors and companies seem to behave like that sometimes. So, Uber and Lyft in the early days, they were acting as if, in terms of the amount of money they were burning through, like one of them was going to win and they were going to take the whole market. It's going to be hugely profitable for them. But that's not always the case, right? That's not always how it turns out.
Right. I think the idea was like there was going to be one dominant global player, and that would be Uber, which obviously did not turn out to be true. And there are many other, I think that's a very important point. So there are many examples of platforms which became somewhat successful, but certainly not as successful as their initial investors they were thinking would be. So there's lots of, Josephine, you're right. In the most successful examples of platforms tend to be either monopolies or duopolies. That's true. But there are many others that end up, maybe not as competitive as regular product markets, but you do see like quite a few platforms active in the same market. So either each of them, different platforms dominating different geographies, or different platforms dominating different verticals.
Yeah, which is would be interesting to know, why some of them are actually really a winner take all as a monopoly, and why some of them are actually a duopoly or more, as you go into other locations. So what are some of the things about platform businesses that defy conventional thinking, rules, business practices? And therefore, what does it mean, for the different stakeholders? Again,
platform businesses are very, very attractive, both for entrepreneurs and for investors, and end up commanding very high valuations. Again, for very good reasons. If they're successful, they tend to be very, very successful. So much more successful, much more valuable because of network effects and low cost structures than traditional businesses. Again, not all of them. So it's very difficult to build successful platform businesses, and not all platform businesses are like Facebook or like Airbnb. Some of them are, much smaller, but on average, it's better. Take the investor point of view, it's much better to invest in all other things equal in platform businesses than non-platform businesses.
Failure rate of these platform businesses is very high. Most of them do not get past the chicken and egg stage of solving that problem. They just don't get enough liquidity, and without much liquidity, they're not offering much value, and people stop using them, and they just can't get past that first stage. Or maybe they do, but there's another firm they're competing with which has been much more successful, and everyone flocks to them, and so they end up unable to compete. If you think about Facebook and the different social media companies that have tried to compete with it, right, over the years, and some which were earlier and some which came later, they had some measure of success, but they ultimately couldn't compete. They didn't have enough mass of users who were really engaged in their product.
There's some unique challenges that platform face. So again, chicken and egg problem, I would say, is disproportionately probably the highest cause of mortality for platform businesses, because the earliest one. But there are others. So there's, for example, another very important issue that some platforms face is leakage. So this is the issue where, again, platforms try to connect, so enable customers to connect or to transact with one another, and hopefully charge some fees for those transactions. Well, in some cases, it proves actually difficult to keep the transactions on the platform. So leakage occurs when the platform allows the relevant parties to meet on the platform, but then they take their transactions off the platform, and therefore the platform does not make its commissions. So this can be a more or less of a serious problem depending on what the product or the service is. But let's say a platform that enables, I don't know, enables families to find people to clean their house. Well, typically they want to find one good cleaner, good cleaner, and then have repeated business transactions with the same person. But once you meet on the platform, it's very difficult to see what the platform can do to maintain the transactions on the platform. And I think there's an example, Julian. There was an example of a company that failed, like in sometime in 2015, I think. That was
HomeJoy?
HomeJoy, yeah. So it was one of the early platform marketplaces for cleaning services, and this is one of the main reasons they failed.
On the extreme end, you had death on the road, which is what I was talking about with regards to Uber delivery or delivery drivers. Actually, like 5 of them that just died, in Australia within 3 months. You have then obviously the whole dating app, of being a predator, playground. And then you have counterfeit home being trashed, on Airbnb. And then you have basic inventory or theft or counterfeit goods, on eBay or Alibaba. How are these unique challenges that this platform faces, right, are changing some of the rules that's beyond business and also really changing our lives?
But obviously in many, many ways. But, it does in a way boil down to this control issue, right? That, as Andrei said, these platforms, because of their business model, they want to enable these organic interactions between their customers. At the same time, those transactions, those interactions can lead to conflicts, right? They can lead to liability problems. They can cause people to be offensive to other people, as in the case of social media, or in the case of Airbnb, they can lead to hosts or guests doing things that have consequences for neighbors, for third parties. In Craigslist's case, they led to many murders. There are many murders that have been linked to Craigslist. So there are bad outcomes that arise when you give this much control to a whole bunch of people, basically, and that's inevitable. And then the platforms, the question that they have to face is, how much do they rein in those actions? How much do they exercise the control? That pushes them back more towards the linear business model, away from that platform extreme. And that is something they may not like from a business point of view, because it incurs a lot more costs, but it becomes necessary because of public relations, because of the externalities on the community, on others, that they have to do something about all these actions that happen that affect others. They can't just be completely silent. And the example of a firm that's completely hands off would be Craigslist, right? They just don't do anything about it. They're murderous, but they're not responsible because they just don't get involved at all. And that approach is not sustainable on something like Facebook, because Facebook has chosen already to exercise some control. It's chosen to ban certain material. Once it makes that decision, it has got itself in the position where it's starting to control things. Then people will hold it responsible for when things go wrong. And that becomes a slippery slope in which it, ends up having to have more and more control over all these matters.
Yeah, so if I can, I think this is a very important and very interesting topic. Like the way sometimes I joke with students, I say the ideal platform business model is like full control and zero responsibility. It's like the opposite with Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. I want lots of power, no responsibility. But obviously that's not possible, right? It's not possible like in a business sense, like from like there's laws of physics that have to apply. So you can't, for example, I can't have a marketplace for products in which I exert all the control over the merchandise, but I have no responsibility for inventory. It's just not going to work, right? I mean, if you want control, you have to bear inventory costs. So there's that aspect. And then there's the aspect that's very important that Julian talked about, which is the issue of externalities on the rest of society, right? So as a society, we may not want platforms to be completely irresponsible and to say, we're just completely hands off. We're enabling interactions, and those interactions have some spillovers outside the platform. But because we're a platform, we don't want to do anything about it. So obviously, this is all there's a lot of talk these days about regulating large platforms. And I mean, Julian and I probably don't agree with all the regulatory proposals, but at a high level, it does make sense to try to get these platforms to accept a little bit of more responsibility than maybe they would naturally be inclined to take.
I mean, whether it comes through regulation or public pressure, I mean, either way, they're sort of forced to do that, right? They can't be completely hands off, because even if regulators didn't step in, the public outcry when there's some murder or there's some, discrimination or some, there's very different opinions, and there's hate speech and so on between different groups, then they're sort of forced to take a position. The public pressure will force them to take a position and to do something about it, and that's where they have to make decisions, right? They have to decide how much they want to control or not.
A lot of that is basically path dependent as a consequence of how they behaved previously, right? In an alternative universe in which, say, Facebook basically acted from the very beginning like Craigslist, so like did not, suppose initially from the beginning, Facebook, like their feed was just chronological, like it will reverse chronological. There's no interference by Facebook. They're not trying to recommend you stuff that will get you addicted and click more. They just didn't get into it. You just see whatever people in your neighborhood, your friends post in reverse chronological order. No interference from Facebook. Now, obviously, it doesn't really make sense from a business standpoint, but if they had done that, I think it would be a lot less likely for people to calling for them to be responsible for the content that goes on, because then they can credibly say, we really do not interfere. But as Julian mentioned, I think the issue is like the moment you try to interfere and actually have some influence over the interactions, so in this case, the social interactions, you do have to accept some responsibility for what goes on. Again, you can't have a lot of power without some responsibility.
And I would say it's unavoidable, right? Because if you do what Andrei described, you're completely hands off and just do reverse chronological order of whatever people post.
Yeah.
People will post stuff that the rest of the community cannot accept, right? And there'll be pressure on you to do something about it. Someone posts a video of a terrorist act, of course there'll be illegal stuff that's posted, but even legal stuff that, a lot of the community doesn't accept, but some minority does, it'll become unavoidable that they have to take some position on it.
Now, there is we probably won't get into it. There's an interesting alternative emerging to this, which is relying on blockchain-enabled mechanisms. So rather than having a centralized authority like a platform make all these decisions and take responsibility and figure out what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, there are many companies, so some who are competing with large social networks, but basically they're competitors. So blockchain-enabled competitors to all the big centralized platforms that we have today. And the premise is they can create this kind of governance mechanisms that are fully decentralized. And they're basically like the community can vote and everything reflects what the community wants, but there's not some arbitrary decision by the platform made on how to govern the platforms.
Okay, so it's like a completely decentralized governance, basically.
Yeah. I think that's I mean, that would be something, again, looking to the future. It's certainly something that we see in some of the through our angel investing activities. There's a number of very interesting initiatives trying to leverage this kind of decentralized governance structures to build the next generation of platforms.
I mean, I would argue that Wikipedia is kind of a very successful example of somewhat decentralized governance, right? And yeah. I don't see too many problems like people complaining Wikipedia has caused bad outcomes, right? It seems like it works pretty well.
Bad definitions and bad news. That's what it is. Bad definition. That would be the only consequence of, a bad contributor for Wikipedia. Wouldn't that be? What you see as, at least from the goods perspective, I've experienced at least eBay, really interfering and making sure that I have a good experience and having insurance coverage, to ensure that, I have the right goods at the end of the day. So Airbnb has also stepped up in terms of having insurance, for the homes. What are some of the things that you see these platforms are doing to step up in terms of their accountability or responsibility for the people under their orchestration, but not fully under their care? that could possibly increase their cost of operation?
So some of the examples you just mentioned. So, I mean, depending on what the platform is and what the interactions are being enabled. So if, for example, if it's commercial transactions, obviously it makes sense to offer insurance, to have, for example, escrow, basically anything that limits the opportunity for one party to take advantage of another party. Now, once you get, so I would say in some sense for commercial transactions, at least conceptually is much more straightforward to figure out what you need to do, right? Like the various, again, escrow, insurance, all kinds of things like that. This gets really tricky with social platforms because it's not a business transaction. So then you get into things like you need to figure out what type of communication, let's take social platforms, like what kind of speech is acceptable or it's not acceptable. And honestly, I don't think any of these platforms has really satisfactorily like found a way that really works. They're all doing some combination of 100-page long community guidelines that no one reads. And you know, they all claim to have like thousands of people, like human moderators that basically look at the content, and then they provided guidelines, and they have to decide what is okay and what's crossed the inappropriate line. So obviously none of these things is very scalable, and it's not just not scalable, it's also not very consistent. I mean, again, part of the problem is you can't enforce these policies in a very consistent way that will satisfy all of your users.
Yeah, I think one thing that you see sort of across many of these platforms that they are using to try and solve these problems is more AI. So, you know, if it's Amazon worrying about fake reviews, or, you know, counterfeit goods on eBay or Alibaba and so on, or even Facebook trying to find pornography, you know, that's hidden in the social platforms. You know, they can certainly make use of big data and AI to try and detect those problems and root them out. So that's something that I just see them using more and more as a way to do it in a scalable way. But you know, as Andrei said, it's certainly not going to be perfect. And in the end, this AI is based on some algorithms, and those algorithms have, you know, some human has put in criteria and objectives, and those may not. I mean, in the case of commerce, it's maybe quite clear. We want to get rid of all the fake goods, and we want to get rid of the fake reviews. But in the case of social media, like deciding what is right and what is wrong is you know, you don't really want one person, like, you know, the CEO of the company making that decision, right? Yeah. So that becomes a lot more controversial anyway.
Yeah, I'm seeing more like all these digital and technology companies are sort of needing to move backwards into what the linear companies and traditional companies are really good at doing, which is the brick and mortar world. And the human connections is beyond the digital, company that they actually need to build up, and therefore possibly increasing their cost of operation and maybe reducing those margins.
But I mean, a lot of these problems we've been talking about are not, I mean, they don't affect all kinds of platforms, right? Like if our typical B2B platform, that does metal exchange or something, they don't have to deal with most of these issues. I mean, all their customers are big customers, they're businesses. They're not even dealing with the types of things Airbnb has to deal with, with bad hosts or bad guests. So it's not necessarily a problem for all types of platforms, but yeah, it certainly is for some. I think the more interesting or more difficult questions, even beyond these, is the externalities that go outside of the platform, because obviously the platforms have an interest in making sure their own platform's working well and that the users are getting a lot of value from it, which means cleaning up all the things like fake reviews and fake goods and so on. But what about the externalities that go outside of the platform that hurt users who don't use the platform? Their interests are not necessarily aligned.
Can we talk a little bit about this whole gig economy and therefore independent workers? Because a lot of these platforms and more are using that model and driving a lot of people to actually use it, because of the gig economy. But at the same time, it is causing all this problem. Obviously, the tax implication, how do you tax the revenue, and they're not full employee, the responsibility, the training, and therefore the liability and all that. And more platforms are actually using this model, and they actually don't need to employ these people and therefore be responsible and actually have the full cost of it, because that goes back to the margins benefit that they have in the beginning.
It goes back to the control cost trade-off that Andrei mentioned, right? If they keep them independent contractors, then they don't have control over what they do, but they have much lower costs, right? And that may be an attractive option for most of these platforms. That they're okay for most of these. I mean, maybe not home cleaning, but for driving, for instance, that they don't need to control, what car they exactly what car they drive, what times they drive, and so on. So they're willing to give up the control in order to have these independent contractors. It makes business sense. The problem is that, from a point of view of labor law, that they do want to control their price, and they do want to limit how often they can reject rights, and so they want to exercise some control. And once they start exercising some control, there's a question: are these really independent contractors, or are these more like employees? And once they get defined as employees, then the firms are responsible for all kinds of other benefits that they have to provide to them. And so that regulatory framework of labor law adds an additional twist to the normal control cost trade-off, because once they start taking a bit more control over them, they actually suddenly have to pay a lot more costs because they get labeled as employees.
I mean, this is where platform meet outdated regulatory framework. So this goes back to the point we made initially. Platform businesses exists along the continuum between pure platform and something else like employer or retailer. Well, the current regulatory framework for determining employees versus independent contractors is just not suited for distinguishing between these different business models. And it's actually like problematic. It's actually like forcing firms to choose either hands-off, pure independent contractors, no training, nothing, just because they don't want to get a risk for their drivers or whatever have you be classified as employees, or they have to decide, okay, we're just going to employ them, which is obviously much higher cost, and that they're no longer platform businesses. So Julian and I have written about this. I mean, we've made the point that I think it would be good to update the regulatory framework in order to allow a broader, more fine-grained spectrum of choices for these platform businesses along the continuum that we talked about earlier in terms of control.
Opinion is more about actually updating the regulatory framework to reflect this new way of operating instead of thinking maybe if this model is actually a sustainable one, from that perspective.
I mean, it could be a matter of having some new categories right in the middle that allow, in the case that you are exercising some control, then you need to provide certain benefits, right? But you don't have to provide the full suite of benefits that would be applicable if someone was your full-time employee, right? Because that's a very different kind of relationship. If someone's my full-time employee, they have no choice. They can't go and work for competitors. If someone drives for Uber, they can also drive for Lyft, right? I'm allowing them that flexibility, so I shouldn't have to provide them all the benefits of a full-time employee. But I might need to provide them certain benefits that are proportional to the time that they're spending on my platform.
Yeah, and that would be more reasonable. And I think that would benefit all parties. It would definitely benefit the workers, it would benefit the platforms, because again, they can opt for this intermediate and more reasonable category, as opposed to, again, having to choose between the two extremes, which seems very outdated.
And if you think about the HomeJoy example of home cleaning, one of the reasons they failed is exactly this, that they couldn't provide the training for their home cleaners to bring them up to a certain standard, because if they did that, then their home cleaners would be classified as employees, and then they would have to provide them with all the full benefits of full-time employees, which was not sustainable for them. And so this outdated regulatory framework sort of forced them into this position where they couldn't provide the optimal level of control and benefits, and therefore, actually forced to close down. I mean, that's one of the contributing factors. There were others, of course.
So as an investor, what advice would you give to investors looking to invest in general or particularly in platform startup?
Oh, I have some important advice. Do not invest in any platform businesses, so that Andrei and I can be the only investors in this space.
Right. But if you do decide to compete with us,
here are all our tips on how to make good investments.
Yeah, so a few things. I mean, I think based on what we talked about, I think it's very important, and as silly as it may sound, drilling down into all the claims of platform businesses and truly asking them, like making sure that if the company claims they're a platform or platform business, are they really a platform business? Do they really have the network effects they claim? A lot of companies would like kind of short circuit that and say, we're a platform business, network effects, therefore we're worth whatever, $200 million, Series A, please invest. So a lot of these, like, it's very short circuited and it relies on very superficial thinking. So what Julian and I like doing, that we think that's the right way to go about it, is like, let's just be very clear. Why is it a platform business? What are the network effects? How strong are those network effects? Okay, like let's dive a little bit deeper. Do you really expect those network effects will last? I mean, do you think they'll be easy to imitate by someone else? How much multi-homing do you think there is on both sides if it's a marketplace? So I think taking time to drilling deeply into actually a lot of the factors that we talked about in in the previous questions is very, especially with platform business, I think is very important.
We have a list of questions. Some of them are sort of going deep into the network effects. So, is it a local or a global network effect? Is there a long tail of suppliers, or is it fairly thick type of market? So there's a whole list of these, and these kind of get to how defensible is the business going to be if they manage to solve the chicken and egg problem and get to the point where they enjoy these network effects. Another type of question we ask is like, so how much, you think about transaction platforms, right? Are the transactions a large number of small transactions, a small number of large transactions, a large number of large transactions, or a small number of small transactions? Obviously, we hate the ones that are a small number of small transactions, right? We don't want to invest in a marketplace for locksmiths, which, there's going to be one transaction a year, or probably less than that, right? How often do you get locked out of your house? One transaction a decade per person, right? It's just
$20
for $40, right? It just doesn't make sense to build a marketplace around those types of businesses. So you can have businesses like Uber and Lyft where you have relatively small transactions, but you have lots and lots of them all the time, so very frequent. Or you can have platforms built around, housing transactions or employment transactions. These are very large transactions, not very frequent. But at least you have to have a big enough scale in the marketplace to make it work.
I would add that I would want to know what is their strategy in terms of reaching critical mass or solving the chicken and egg problem. That would be one question I will ask as an investor, because it's so hard to get there. You know what I mean? That would lead us to the
chicken first. The answer is always get the chicken first, Josephine.
I'm for the egg.
I mean, again, we go into a lot of depth into the questions that we ask about platform businesses in our Substack. So platformchronicles.substack.com. That's exactly how we think about platform businesses, and we hope they'll be helpful for both entrepreneurs and investors.
What are some of the bad ideas that you have seen in terms of business platform startup that you have come across as investors?
This one called Sniff Spot. And Sniff Spot is designed for dogs. So you can take your dog to someone else's yard so that they have space where they can run around without having to run into other dogs, right? So these are particularly for antisocial dogs. Although I think, if you don't have a park nearby where you can take your dog, and many parks probably ban dogs, right? Then this could be certainly an option. So, when we're thinking about this as a marketplace, like, it sounds a little bit like it's a fairly small niche product. How many people have antisocial dogs? But we're also thinking, who has yards that they want, other people's dogs running around in, right? Well, those people who have big yards are probably people who are reasonably wealthy. And do they really want to sell their yards for $5 an hour to have someone else's dogs running around? It just didn't seem like a very good match in terms of, matching the demand and supply. The people who have the supply are not the types of people who would tend to want to rent out that space. That was our thinking, right? Well, from what we can see from looking at the website, seems to be quite a lot of supply. It's across the US at this stage, as far as I can see, and in most cities, there's 40 or 50 spots where you could take your dog. Whether that's critical mass, I don't know, because how far are you willing to drive to bring your dog to someone else's yard? But it certainly seems to be still up and going.
Most of the people who own stock, they have to make sure they get the dog out every day. So that's huge amount of frequency for you.
Oh, well, speaking of which, we would worry a little bit about leakage in those cases, right? Because once the owner takes their dog to someone else's place a few times who lives around the corner, then they don't really need SniffSpot as a platform, right? They can just go direct. So that was another concern that, you think about this as a marketplace. But, it always surprises us. Like we looked at lots of, weird and wonderful ideas for marketplaces. And some of them work and some of them don't. And it's pretty hard to predict just based on the idea.
Sorry, I can give a couple other examples, which are, again, very amusing, but I think Julian and I have learned to, it's fun to poke fun at them, but who knows, maybe there's a unicorn among these. So one of my favorite is Naturist B&B. So it's basically Airbnb that provides access to accommodations, which I think are naturist friendly, i.e. friendly to people that want to be naked all the time, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, you can go to naturistbnb.com to figure out exactly. Then there was one in Japan, which I can't remember what the name was, but it's basically it was summarized in a Vice article called Human Uber. And basically you can essentially pay someone to go to events that you don't want to go to. And then they're wearing some sort of iPad that projects your face. So that basically says, I care just enough to hire someone to come to your events, but not enough that I wanted to make the trip. So someone else is basically shows up in my place.
I'm not sure about the human Uber. It sounds like a human avatar to me, actually, from that perspective.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, something like that. I like the tagline. Human Uber is let someone else live your life for you, so you don't have to.
So, and then you have another one, which is Uber for horses. Is that right? Is that a real?
Yes, it is. That is right. And when I say Uber for horses, I always have to clarify that the horses in this Uber are the passenger, not the driver. So this is in case you have a horse. If I understand correctly, in case you have you ever had this problem where you had to take your horse and drive it to the next town and did not have an appropriate vehicle? It finds someone that basically has a vehicle which can accommodate horses and help you transport your horse to the nearby town.
There is a startup recently that I've met that is in Australia. They are big into horses. So what they do is a marketplace for horses, actually to buy and sell and to own a horse, but not transportation of horse. Not transportation of horse, actually.
Yeah. So I think we've come to the conclusion that there's a marketplace for everything, right? Yes. I mean, someone has. Whatever you can imagine, someone has built it.
Someone at least has put up a website.
Please comment on the video, actually, if you have come across really interesting, actually, platform businesses and marketplace that, we should know about. I hope we have clarified what platform businesses are. And in our next video, we want to talk about how you can move from a product company to a platform business. If you are a product company and linear business and you want to become a platform business, we're going to talk more in detail about how you can do that.
And we can make a promise, give us your product or service, we'll turn it into a platform in 30 seconds or less, or your money back.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the video.
Okay. Andrei made the promise, not me. It's his money back,
I've done this
not
with
our money
students.
back.